My name's Alex Edmans. I'm a professor of finance at London Business School, and I'm thrilled to be here at the Daring to Leap Veristel Institute conference. So about 15 years ago, before ESG was a bandwagon, I wanted to look at, are companies that are responsible to society, are they going to be better off? Now, the biggest problem is, well, how do you measure ESG to begin with? And so what I chose to look at the list of the 100 best companies to work for in America. So why did I look at that? It looks at employees, but you might think, well, employees, that's only one part of the pie. What about the environment or suppliers? But I chose to look at employees because they are important in nearly every company. Whereas with the environment, yes, climate change is a massive threat, but if you're a tech firm, maybe climate isn't so important because your impact is not so high. Whereas every company, employees are the beating heart of the company, so that's why I found it was something was fully material. Also, the 100 best companies to work for was a list available from 1984, so I had tons of data to make sure I wasn't just getting lucky in a small time period. And why is that key? Well, ESG is a pretty new phenomenon, but many data sources have only been around, let's say, for the last 10 years. And if I showed you that ESG paid off between 2010 and 2019, you might think those were 10 great years for the stock market. Maybe ESG only works in good times. Maybe right now in a pandemic, we should forget about it and just focus on profit. But because my data started in 1984, I had things like the financial crisis, like September the 11th and the collapse of the internet bubble, so I could make sure that this is something that holds in bad times as well as good times. And as we know, correlation does not imply causation, so I did further tests to suggest that it's employee satisfaction that leads to better performance, rather than better performance allowing a company to spend on employee satisfaction. So after all of that, let me just get to the results, because that's what's most of interest to the practitioners. And I found that the best companies to work for delivered shareholder returns that beat their peers by 2.3 to 3.8% per year over a 28-year period. That is 89 to 184% cumulative. So simply put, companies that are treating their workers better, they're not just being moral and ethical, they're also being business savvy and financially astute, because they're leading to better profits and performance. Because when you invest in employees, you're not just giving them part of the pie, you are growing the pie. And importantly, notice that my measure of employees was not looking at do no harm. It's not looking at the amount of injuries or labor unrest or strikes. It's looking at the actively doing good. Can we be in the top 100 firms in terms of how we treat workers? And that absolutely pays off. Now, you might think, well, I published my study in 2012, right? Surely this is now useless, because everybody should know about it. Everybody should be buying the best companies, and there should no longer be any returns to employee satisfaction. But interestingly, just 2 months ago in October, right, what we found was that this paper was replicated independently by other authors, not only for the initial period, but also for the 10 years that happened since. Now, this is crazy, right? Because if markets were efficient, then people should take this into account. And you might think ESG is all the rage now. People are looking at employees and they're concerned with trying to invest in companies that treat them well. However, when people look at employees, they might again be looking at the do no harm metrics, like strikes and injuries and turnover, not the amount of things that are about actively doing good, things like credibility, camaraderie, respect. Those are things that are not in most metrics because they're really difficult to measure. And those are the things that are delivering sustainable outperformance. Let me just go to one more study, because I want to expand it beyond employees, because some of you might care about other dimensions. And so what this is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board materiality map. And it goes stakeholder by stakeholder to highlight which are the stakeholders that are most important in every industry. So if you look at the first column here, which is mining, right, the environment is really important. If you are Rio Tinto and you blow up Duke and Gorge, then that's going to be really bad for your business. But if we move to financials, well, the environment is not so important to you, at least not directly, because you're not using raw materials when you run a bank. But selling practices and product labeling, that is really important. If you're Wells Fargo and if you're in a fake bank account scandal, that's going to be really bad for your reputation. So why does that matter? That matters because of the evidence. So what this study did is it took some ESG data from MSCI, which is perhaps the best known data source, and it looks at companies that do well across the board. They do well on every sustainability issue. What they found was that they did not beat the market. They only beat the market by 1.5% per year, which was insignificant. So the common mantra that we hear, that ESG always pays off, it's just not there in the data. But then when they redid the study, by looking at companies that do well on the material issues, but scale back on the immaterial ones, they do beat the market by 4.8% per year. And again, it's worth pausing to highlight the significance of this result. Right, companies that are purposeful and responsible are not all things to all people. They're not ticking every single box, but they're focusing on the couple of issues that are most material to its business model. And again, just like the first part, you might think, well, this is kind of obvious. Don't we all know what it is? But again, I'm going to have a slightly different view of what is ESG to what we typically think. To do this, let me tell you a story. So let's go back to March 2020, which was when the COVID pandemic was really breaking out. And Boris Johnson, who's the Prime Minister of the UK, he launched this UK Ventilator challenge. And that was to challenge companies that maybe used to make vacuum cleaners to instead pivot to make ventilators. And that sounds great. Let's start making ventilators. But the problem is that ventilators are pretty difficult to operate. You need some highly trained staff. And because of underfunding of the UK's National Health Service, we just didn't have enough highly trained staff to do that. So you could have great ventilators, but nobody to operate it. Yet there were some consultants from UCL, University College London, who remembered that 30 years ago, back in the 1990s, people used to do something called continuous positive airway pressure on some really basic machines called the whisper flow. So these machines were so basic, nearly anybody could operate them. You did not need special training. Now, the big problem was this whisper flow was obsolete. Right? That was the machine from the 1990s. How would it be possible to modernize this machine and bring it to 2020? And even getting a hold of a whisper flow was really challenging. But where could they find it? The only place they could find an old whisper flow was in the museum of University College London. Can you spot it? Well, it's right here, based next to all of the other artifacts. And so they thought, well, can we just take this out of the museum cupboard and just reverse engineer it? And so what University College London did is they brought together the strength of healthcare engineering and mechanical engineering and their hospital to see, can we reverse engineer it? But alone, even though they had loads of skills, they did not have the precision engineering skills of a company. So they brought in a company, and that company was Mercedes, in particular Mercedes Powertrain, and that's the division of Mercedes that makes Formula One engines for the like of Lewis Hamilton. And so they came, they drove their car down with their computer-aided design equipment, and that team got together with UCL, and within 100 hours, they made the first prototype of the new whisper flow, which was the machine they called the UCL Ventura. And as you can see, really simple, something that anybody can operate. But importantly, they designed it in such a way that it could be mass produced at scale. And mass produced they did. They used the factory in Northamptonshire in England to make 1,000 machines every day. And then having come up with this great device to save people's lives, how did they make money from it? They didn't. They gave away the blueprint, the secret of how to make the UCL Ventura to 1,300 teams in 25 countries around the world to help all of them combat coronavirus. So what has this got to do with ESG? And some of you might think nothing, right? Because I'd like you to think about the answer to these two questions. How did Mercedes' involvement in UCL Ventura improve its ESG scores? And what reputational hit would Mercedes have suffered had it not been involved? And the answer to both questions is pretty much nothing. But when we typically think about ESG, we think about metrics such as carbon emissions or water usage or injury rates. They're often about do no harm. Like good ESG is avoiding reputational risk from doing bad things like emitting excessive carbon or injuring our workers. And absolutely, that is important, right? Companies should do no harm. But that is completely silent about whether companies are actively doing good, right? So if Mercedes is involved in Ventura, that does not help on any of its scores on water usage or carbon emissions. In fact, it probably increases them. But what it does do is it creates a huge amount of value for society. And the answer to the second question is pretty similar. Like, what is the reputational hit had they not done it? Nothing. Nobody would have ever thought that Mercedes would have even been able to make these breathing machines, right? Its focus was on Formula One engines. And again, we often view ESG as avoiding a bad reputational impact, right? Doing what's necessary to avoid being in the media. But instead, I want to think about, let's change our views to actively doing good. Going above and beyond what society requires, what we're going to need to avoid being in the news, and let's think about how can we proactively and creatively use the resources at our disposal to solve social problems. And so why do I think ESG is much more about actively doing good than doing no harm? Two reasons. The first reason is the moral and ethical case. Right now in 2021, given the scale of the world's challenges, coronavirus, income inequality, climate change, automation, it is not enough for a company to say, I'm not injuring my workers, I'm good. Well, you need to actively do good and solve these problems. But the second reason is the business and financial case. And you might think it's surprising that the conference invited me as a finance professor to speak about responsibility. But what I like to highlight is that there is also a financial and business reason for purpose. Profit and purpose need not be in conflict. And to do this, let me introduce a framework that I developed in a recent book. So we often think that the value that a company creates is given by a pie. And that pie we can split to investors in the form of profit, or stakeholders or society in the form of fair taxes to the government, fair wages, fair prices. And we think that purpose is about splitting the pie more fairly. We could donate some profits to charity, paying higher taxes than we need to, pay higher wages than we can get away with. And again, please don't get me wrong, but part of responsibility is fairness and sharing the spoils. But purpose can't just be about a fair split of the pie. Why? Well, the first is if ESG just means splitting the pie differently, many CEOs won't want to do it. Like we saw just over 2 years ago, 181 CEOs in the US signed the Business Roundtable statement claiming they're going to serve wider society. But when the rubber hit the road, many of them didn't really put it into practice. And you might think, well, why would they? Why would you do something to cut into your profits? And the second reason is that if purpose is about splitting the pie differently, then it's bad for investors. Now, some of you might think, I don't care. But we like to think of investors as nameless, faceless capitalists. Investors are them, society is us. If we can take from them and give to us, then that's good for everybody. But investors are not them. They are us. They include parents saving for their children's education, pension funds saving for retirement. So any repurposing of a society absolutely must take investors seriously. So this is why my view of ESG is that it's about growing the pie. We do want to increase the orange, but the way we do that is not by giving them a greater slice of what's already there, but by actively creating value, doing good, coming up with some crazy ideas like Mercedes making breathing machines. And the whole beauty of that is that if we are serving society by creating value, ultimately investors might be able to benefit because the company might become more profitable. So going back to Mercedes, right, the reputational, the motivational impact on current employees must be massive. But if they can think, we as a company, we're doing our part to serve wider society, then that's something hugely motivating for workers. It might attract new workers. It might attract more customers to this company, which really helped out in the pandemic in a way that it didn't need to. Now, you might think, well, is that indeed the case? Right? Halfway into my talk, you might think, well, all I've said so far sounds great, but it sounds like wishful thinking. Well, I'm just conjecturing that if a company serves society in the way that Mercedes did, magically some profits will appear, but that seems kind of too good to be true. Right, so where's the evidence? And this is what my day job is as a business school professor, is not just to come up with nice stories, but to think about, is this something which holds in large scale, or is it something that I've just picked one story because it happens to work? And the important thing whenever you look at evidence is to make sure that the evidence is really rigorous because of this concern of confirmation bias. So what is this? But that is the temptation to accept evidence if it confirms what people would like to be true. Right? And that's particularly a problem with ESG. Why? We would love to live in a world in which ethical companies perform better. And so any paper that claims that purpose pays off, we're going to latch onto it and believe it. And so a few years ago, I gave a TED talk called What to Trust in a Post-Truth World, just about how discerning and critical we need to be about evidence, particularly if it is something that we really feel strongly about.